was some time ago that I found out about their work in the context of looking at the Biennale in São Paulo during the 70s, which was a period when there'd been a boycott in '69 internationally, and the history was really unknown, and I think there was an assumption that not much happened during that decade. But actually, and in the 1973 Biennale in particular, which is featured in Frieze in Genilson's participation, there was a lot of kind of collective group activity encouraged in that year, and a real focus on younger artists, really quite young artists. How old you were at that time?
I was 22.
Yeah, early 20s, like people who were kind of only just coming out of art schools and their forms of study. So anyway, we were going to begin by asking both Genilson and Lydia how they began to start working together, and that coinciding really with Genilson's arrival to São Paulo from the northeast of Brazil, from Recife. Yeah. So I want to begin by asking you how that occurred, how you got to know each other, and how you entered into the artistic scene in São Paulo. Maybe Michael can translate.
Bom, boa noite a todos. Eu cheguei em São Paulo no final dos anos de 66.
I arrived in São Paulo at the end of '66.
E eu fui para São Paulo contratado para fazer uma exposição numa galeria.
Being hired to do an exhibition in a gallery.
Com uma pessoa que tinha uma galeria em São Paulo, especialidade em artistas do Nordeste. E eu vim, no final de 66, já com a exposição pronta. Era um trabalho que tinha toda uma formação do ateliê ainda, era um trabalho super figurativo.
It was a gallery that specialised in art from the northeast, and it was a very figurative kind of art. It was quite different from what Genilson was going to be doing later.
E essa exposição foi um grande sucesso comercial. Eu continuei trabalhando com essa galeria e fiquei em São Paulo a partir de então, né?
It was very commercially orientated and commercially successful art, the kind of thing he'd been doing in the workshops in the northeast, and that's how he started off with this commercially orientated gallery in São Paulo.
Eu trabalhei com essa galeria até o começo dos anos 70, quando já havia um conflito entre a minha busca em termos de arte. Eu procurava uma outra coisa e a galeria queria que eu fizesse aquilo que eu estava fazendo até então.
He carried on with that gallery until the beginning of the 70s, but it was a developing conflict between what he wanted to do personally as an artist and the outlook of the gallery, and by the early 70s, carrying on with that gallery was becoming no longer viable.
Então, no começo dos anos 70, no final dos anos 60, eu conheci a Lydia em uma exposição, ela foi uma individual que eu estava fazendo nessa galeria, e eu a conheci, conversamos bastante, em seguida ela fez a primeira individual dela também, e no começo dos anos 70 nós nos reunimos num evento, num acontecimento que teve em São Paulo, porque vivíamos em plena ditadura.
They actually met doing an exhibition. It was an exhibition that Lydia did. They met at an exhibition at the end of the 60s. After that, Lydia did her first individual exhibition, and this was taking place in the political context, of course, of the Brazilian dictatorship at the time.
Havia movimento em São Paulo, partindo dos artistas, não como a feira, a Frieze, que é uma coisa das galerias. Esse movimento partia dos artistas de expor na rua. Então, existia uma praça em São Paulo, existia uma praça em São Paulo chamada Praça da República, onde os artistas levavam os trabalhos e simplesmente colocavam sobre os gradis e expunham.
There was an interesting artistic phenomenon in São Paulo at the time, in that in the Praça da República, a central square, artists were exhibiting their works, so this was art being displayed to the public directly by the artist, not through galleries like Frieze at the moment, and this was something completely new, again, in the political context of the dictatorship.
Obviamente, nesse movimento da praça eu conheci também o Francisco Iñarra, que acabou sendo o terceiro elemento do grupo. Já conversava bastante com a Lydia, e nós percebemos que tínhamos problemas semelhantes, né? Eu queria sair da galeria, nós queríamos participar dos salões, porque era a única maneira de a gente se mostrar ao público, a um grande público.
So this was the context in which he met Lydia, but also the context in which he met Francisco. They were looking for a means of displaying their art in what was quite a restrictive context, looking for, in Genilson's sense, the context looking for a way of getting out of the gallery and providing his art to the public in a different way.
No final dos anos 60 e começo dos anos 70, aliás, no começo dos anos 70, nós resolvemos discutir e resolvemos montar um grupo, que era uma maneira de adensar as nossas propostas.
By the beginning of the 70s, they came up with the idea of actually forming a group so that they could bring their artistic ideas together and work collectively.
E apresentamos um trabalho, era para um salão do Rio de Janeiro que seria feito no final, aliás, no começo dos anos 71, chamado Salão de Verão, e a nossa proposta era um trabalho chamado Lanchonarte.
So the first project in 71 was for an artistic space in Rio, the name being Lanchonarte, which is a kind of play on words in Portuguese between lanchonete, restaurant, and arte, art. So this was for a space in Rio, which was their first significant collective project.
Na verdade, era uma grande crítica ao consumismo na arte, consumismo em geral.
It was a criticism of consumerism, both in the artistic context and consumerism more generally.
E é o processo mesmo, a própria forma dos salões. A gente questionava muito a forma de apresentação. Existia uma ficha, como poderia dizer, um formulário. Um formulário onde só se poderia escrever ou pintura, ou escultura, ou gravura. Então, se fosse um trabalho diferente, não era aceito.
They found themselves faced with a very restrictive context artistically. So with galleries, for example, when presenting work, typically it would be the case that you'd have to present your work in one of a very small number of specific categories. It would be engraving or painting, but they wanted to fight against these restrictive categories and do something which was beyond those boundaries that existed at the time.
Can I just ask, maybe say a little bit more about what these salons were at the time, where they were located, and how those kind of opportunities?
Os salões eram feitos, em geral, organizados pelas prefeituras das cidades, né? Secretaria de Educação da cidade ou do estado.
The artistic salons were typically organized by City Hall, by the local governments.
Onde os artistas apresentavam as propostas de trabalho e havia uma comissão que aceitava ou não o trabalho.
Artists would present their work, and there'd be a commission which would either accept the work for the salon or not.
Evidentemente, esse primeiro trabalho, nós mandamos para o Rio, mas o trabalho foi recusado no salão.
Their first project, they submitted it to the salon in Rio, but in fact it was rejected.
Chegamos em São Paulo com esse trabalho de volta do Rio e nos reunimos e soubemos de um outro salão que ia acontecer em São Paulo e decidimos mostrar esse mesmo trabalho, só que ele cresceu um pouco mais.
So they found themselves back in São Paulo with a piece of work which had been rejected in Rio, thinking, okay, well, what should we do with this now? And so they were ready then to present it in São Paulo, the same piece of work.
Nós mandamos para o Salão de Santo André, o trabalho já tinha mudado o nome e tinha passado para Restaurarte, uma mistura entre restaurante e restauração do trabalho anterior.
So it's the Restaurarte piece of work which is now going to be presented to the Santo André Salon in São Paulo.
71,
the year is 1971.
Não foi fácil para entrar no salão, havia muita questão da parte dos organizadores do salão e houve uma interferência de um grande crítico de arte chamado Mário Schember e ele acabou falando com o pessoal do salão e falando que era um trabalho de arte, que era preciso que o salão aceitasse, né, aquele tipo de proposta.
It was very difficult to get the Restaurante accepted, but fortunately there was the intervention of a critic, Mario Schemberg. Okay, Mario Schemberg, who was able to wield some influence and get it accepted.
Nós apresentamos o trabalho, era um trabalho interessante, mas muito conceito, muito questionamento. Tinha uma série de módulos que criamos. Tinha crítico, continuava crítico, né? Crítico aos salões, a forma de organização dos salões.
This piece of work clearly had a very critical characteristics. It was itself a criticism of the way in which artistic salons worked at the time.
Nesse mesmo ano, nós mandamos uma proposta em 1971 para o Salão Jovem Arte Contemporânea.
In 1971, they submitted a proposal to Jovem Arte Contemporânea, Young Contemporary Art in São Paulo.
Foi feita essa nova proposta foi feita dessa Jovem Arte Contemporânea, que consistia, o museu existe uma rampa de acesso ao museu em 3 níveis. Né?
So in this new space, it consisted of a ramp up and 3 levels in the museum.
E o nosso trabalho fechava esses descansos da rampa nos 3 níveis, fechava completamente com uma pintura, e o trabalho chamava-se A Cerca da Natureza, que também é um jogo de palavras em português. It's like about nature. E a cerca como fence.
So this piece of work that they put in it consisted of closing off the ramps, and they called it a cerca da natureza in Portuguese, the fence or the enclosure of nature.
With a small, narrow door.
But also meaning about nature.
Meaning about a cerca.
A cerca, oh, sorry, okay.
It's
About nature.
Do you want to say a little bit more, Genilson, about the Jacques exhibitions in particular,
Right.
and maybe how they distinguish from the other salons in São Paulo? You could translate just to make sure.
You want him to
It just wants to make sure that Genilson also understands.
explicar mais a Jovem Arte Contemporânea de 72.
Sim.
Como diferia, não a 71, mas...
Sim, a de 72. Bom, foi feita essa exposição em 71, ganhamos aquisição com esse trabalho. E em 72, porque esse salão acontecia a cada ano no museu. E era um salão completamente diferente dos outros, porque era organizado pelo Walter Zanini, que era o diretor do Museu de Arte Contemporânea, e da Jovem Arte Contemporânea de 1972. A diretoria do museu reuniu-se com alguns artistas e resolveu dividir o espaço do salão, o espaço expositivo, em lotes.
In 1972, the Young Contemporary Art in São Paulo, they had an exhibition in which the authorities divided the exhibition space into certain smaller individual spaces, into lots for individual exhibitors.
Foi feito um sorteio entre os artistas que se inscreveram. Obviamente, cada um ganhou um lote, e já no final do sorteio, nós não tínhamos ganho nenhum lote, mas a Lydia ganhou um lote pequeno.
They entered a draw to see if they would be able to use one of the spaces within the exhibition area, and unfortunately they weren't selected. But Lydia got herself a space, and that was their way in to work in this exhibition.
Evidentemente que esse espaço era muito pequeno para um trabalho nosso, e pensamos, nós observamos também que vários artistas europeus tinham mandado, artistas europeus e artistas brasileiros que viviam aqui na Europa, tinham mandado propostas, e nós vimos que eles também não tinham sido sorteados. Então resolvemos apresentar uma proposta que denominamos de incluir os excluídos.
They ended up using this lot with using this space to submit a piece of work the name of which was to include the excluded. There was a context in which there was a lot of competition from more established Brazilian artists and also European artists, so the name of their work was Include the Excluded.
Havia várias propostas muito interessantes, como o Yannis Kunelis, o Daniel Pirran, Sérvulo Esmeraldo, que era um artista brasileiro que vivia em Londres e Paris, e Arthur Pisa. Foram vários artistas que mandaram propostas e que achamos que deveria participar. Né?
But they were sending the proposals to you, not to the chef.
No, to the museum. Professor Zanini, the director of the museum, had also invited foreign and Brazilian artists living abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And they were not even considered for the drawing, only because they were not here, living in the country or in the local. So we thought that was not nice, because I was so excited to get all these foreign artists that I was curious to know. I knew their work, so that's why I already had included them, and I wanted to include the other excluded. Why not?
Você quer continuar sobre o processo?
Foi muito trabalhoso, porque era pouco tempo de montagem e eram muitas propostas para construir. Né?
So we had to execute all those plans that the foreigners, residents abroad, had sent to the museum, the plan for their work, and we went to the director and we asked for those plans, and we had to make those up, each plan, and I think there were like 6 or 7 or 8 artists, but it was a lot of work. Muito trabalho.
Em 72 tivemos outros trabalhos também, existiam, em 2 anos aconteceram em São Paulo uma Bienal, que era no intervalo da Bienal Internacional. Eles fizeram, por 2 anos, bienais nacionais. Em 72 nós participamos com a proposta e em 74 também eu participei, mas eu participei só junto com o Francisco. Mas logo em seguida veio a nossa proposta para a Bienal de 73.
In 1972, Genilson and Lydia submitted a piece of work for a national Brazilian Biennale, which they also did in 1974, and their idea was already developing for a very successful piece in the International São Paulo Biennale of 1973.
And at that time, did the biennial, how did you perceive the biennial? Was it any more interesting than the Jacques exhibitions or the other salons? What was its status for you at that point in the 70s? Just wait for it to translate.
Sim, era muito diferente. A Bienal Nacional era uma coisa mais organizada em função do governo, da ditadura, né, que estava acontecendo na época. Era uma exposição muito dirigida. Então participamos, mas não era o ideal. Né? Inclusive, na de 74, entramos com... quando a Lydia já tinha viajado para Nova York, entramos com um trabalho mais crítico, né, de uma certa forma. Assim.
The context between the Biennale, the National Biennale of 72 and 74, and the international one was different. That Genilson is saying that the presence of the dictatorship was much more keenly felt in the National Biennale of 72 and 74. Indeed, in 74, by which time Lydia had already started pursuing her art in New York, that they entered a piece of work which was directly critical or had a directly critical element of the dictatorship. Whereas in 1973, the context was different.
I think maybe when we have the questions of question and answer, it might be nice to talk in a bit more detail, if we have time, about to include the excluded project. But maybe now it would be good to talk more about the proposal that you made for the 1973 biennial and how the proposal was made. Make sure you wait for the translation. How the proposal was made and also how the work unfolded. Melhor se você...
Se eu entender o que você falou primeiro.
No, it's just if I ask the question, Genilson needs to understand the question.
Bom, a nossa proposta para a Bienal de 73 chamava Pontos de Vista, e era um trabalho onde a gente ressaltava a questão da individualidade do coletivo. Então, cada artista trabalhou com um canto do espaço da instalação e queriam mostrar peças individuais, trabalhos individuais, mas com a leitura coletiva.
The 1973 work at the biennial points of view should be understood as individual works, but within a collective context. That each of the three individual artists had their own individual corner within a shared project.
Essa sequência, por exemplo, seria da Lydia. Esse é o canto que a Lydia trabalhou. Ela trabalhou num canto de 90 graus.
Por isso seria interessante se a Lydia fala pouco sobre a sua...
You see, from my memory, the São Paulo Biennial of 1972 was a national biennial. There's no more national biennial because they were doing the national in order to choose the artists to represent Brazil in the following year. But when we did the 1972 and up to 72, every competition that we would try to go, we would do individual works wherever we found space. There was no connection from one artist's work to the other. We just went there together because that was more practical, it was more convenient, fun, and all that. And because we had convinced the organizers that we wanted to apply paint to this wall maybe, but we promised not to make it dirty, or if we put a nail on the floor, we're going to take it out. There was always a negotiation, there was always some paper to get a license, sort of. And in 73, we heard that there would be some interest for group works. And there were like some groups coming from the north of Brazil and other states bringing groups. And it is easier to get into the biennial if we were a group.
So they were actively encouraging people to...
Yes, somehow. And we know, I was thinking, if that's the case, we are individuals, so we have to find a way to work this space that they're giving us, but we cannot be messy like the 1970 or 71 experience. It has to have some easy reading, has to be attractive, has to make sense and work as one, but each one can do whatever. So that was 3 weeks of a challenge that was really intense.
Do you want to talk a bit about what we can see in these images? So this was your, you all chose a corner.
So that was the corner.
And that was your corner.
I decided I'm going to put up a play, like cover it, so that's another dimension. And I'm going to divide it. It was more or less continuation of my work that I was doing individually. I was showing at the university also. I had a class, annual show. So it was more or less continuation of my two-dimensional work. So I had already that idea. Also, we had also, submitted a plan, more or less very primitive, but we had an idea of who was going to occupy which corner. So mine, I kept doing it and photographing, and I would photograph each one's stage, and I would run to college, to the lab and develop the pictures and copy it. And we had a room reserved for showing the process.
So the
of the struggle.
The process was being shown
In a
as
separate
part of
room.
the installation.
Within the space, we made up another room, so people could go in and see
So
the
they could see how it had been
Yes,
yesterday and how it changed today.
some people would come every day to look at it and ask, how come you're changing? How come every day is different? And we finished just at up to the time the international juror was coming to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a lot of things of each one observing what the other was doing and trying to match or harmonize at least. And like Francisco, he did so many different plans until Genilson finished with another wall that belonged to that space, facing the public area. And so
this corner is
Francisco.
Francisco Iñarra, who's the founder of the group.
And finally, he assimilated or took the stone that Genilson had found somewhere, and he had placed on that wall,
So
covering the space of the process.
So
Eu
Genilson.
gostaria de falar um pouco sobre isso.
Sim, so Gia, do you want to talk
Bom,
about?
eu gostaria de falar um pouco sobre essa sequência aí, porque significa muito para mim, porque é um momento de mudança entre o trabalho anterior, o trabalho que eu já carregava das informações do ateliê, aliás, eu gostaria de salientar que o ateliê coletivo que eu participei em Recife, eu entrei nesse ateliê quando eu tinha 11 anos, fui aluno, depois fiz parte do ateliê, e para mim, só em São Paulo eu vim perceber a importância que teve esse trabalho, porque era um ateliê coletivo e representou muito quando eu juntei com o grupo. Foi um trabalho muito semelhante, porque eram coisas individuais em Recife também, entre os artistas que faziam parte desse ateliê, e depois da nossa proposta, né, de grupo, de trabalhar individualmente.
For Genilson, the 1973 exhibition marks an important change, an important artistic development, and yet with also similarities between the kind of work he was doing in São Paulo as an individual within a collective endeavour, because back in Recife, the workshop was a collective workshop, and he'd been doing art there since the age of 11, and also, as in São Paulo later, he was an individual within a collective endeavour, although the artistic context in São Paulo was already something completely different, conceptual art rather than this comparatively much more figurative art which he had been doing in Recife.
Or he reacted to
He reacted
to you.
O Francisco gostou da pedra que eu estava usando e resolveu usar no canto dele também, né? Só que, em vez de cair, ele queria encontrar uma leveza para o objeto.
Francisco liked the rock, the stone that was introduced, and he decided to incorporate it in his own corner of the work as well.
And how long did the whole process last? For how long were you changing it?
I think it took 3 weeks. in the beginning, it was like understanding the implications of it, and it was kind of slow, but then once the ideas were decided, then there were the details of it I could play with to make it even more connected, which was the case of that column connecting to another drawing. It was like three-dimensional, one-dimensional. It was a play with different dimensions, which means also what an individual can pursue, like different ideas, but within the context. That was the meaning of our experiment, sort of collective, but we are mostly artists, and an artist is an individual, cannot be a collective artist, but
no.
So yeah, so my thing was like contradictions of ideas.
And the title of the work was Points of View.
Points of view, because most of the artists within the dictatorship period would work with phrases, languages, images, with violence. Sometimes, you know, it was kind of too political. But I thought we should be very subtle, and there are ways of looking soft and not violent through violence, but we had ways of expressing our thoughts. So points of view was the way we decided would tell visually, but also in thinking, our opinion, individual opinion.
And do you want to say a little bit, both of you, either of you, about how the work was, about responses to the work, how the work was received, and what it led to as the group developed?
Entre a crítica nossa, pouco devagar, né? Entre a crítica no Brasil, pouco devagar. Foi mais sentido pelo público estrangeiro, né? O trabalho, por críticos estrangeiros, né? Esse trabalho. Essa prancha, recentemente, há uns 3 anos atrás, eu fui convidado pela Galeria Jaqueline Martins para fazer um individual, e fazia uns 30 anos que eu não expunha individualmente em São Paulo. Então ela queria apresentar o meu trabalho, mas queria que eu mostrasse um lado histórico da exposição. E eu fiquei pensando, como histórico, né? Como que eu vou conciliar as duas coisas? E decidi remontar a prancha, o trabalho da prancha, porque eu considerei essa prancha uma espécie de divisor de águas entre o meu período anterior e o depois, né? O que vinha depois, para mim. Então, essa prancha realmente para mim é como se fosse um divisor de águas.
The 1973 exhibition, it was the response was more from foreign critics in Brazil. The reception, there wasn't much critical response to it. It was more response from foreign critics. 3 years ago, Genilson was involved in a retrospective exhibition, and he wanted to go back to 1973 and look at this piece of work, particularly the one with the piece of wood, because it marks something of a watershed for him in his own artistic career, a clear difference between what had gone before and what came afterwards.
And when you were talking about the reception of the work and gaining more interest from people outside of the country, but it did in fact win, it was awarded a prize at the biennial.
Yes, we had a prize.
Não tinha muita importância, não teve muita importância. Aliás, a única crítica que realmente falou bem do trabalho foi a Arte Amaral, que escreveu um texto, inclusive, questionando o comportamento da crítica em relação ao nosso trabalho.
The 1973 piece, Points of View, it did win a prize within the biennial, but the only really critic who really latched onto it and understood it and said positive things was
Araci Amaral.
who actually spoke in his response about the lack of critical response to the piece of work. So he was one critic who latched onto it.
She. And for how long did you carry on working as the three of you together after this, after 1973?
Well, you see, the interesting thing that happened is one of the person who would show up every day to see what has changed that day was a director of a gallery in Caracas, the best gallery in Caracas, and she wanted us to work in her gallery, so we made it in '75. I had already gone to New York. Actually, this was the first international event that we had participated in, and we met foreign artists. One of the artists is Klaus Rinke, and he really liked our work, and he would stop by often. And I happened to help him with the technical things, so inside the biennial for the execution of his work. So I went to New York after that. He encouraged and all that. But from New York, I went to Caracas, and they came to Caracas, and in 2 weeks we did the show, and we really had a very good reception there. In '77, I was invited to the biennial, and they were invited as a duo. And I didn't even know how it happened, but the director of the Cranbrook Academy of Museum in Michigan negotiated with the consulate of Brazil to have us together again, but in his museum. And that happened in '79, except Francisco couldn't go, so we worked, both of us. So in the end, we completed the circle of the 70s, from 1970 to 1979.
So you came back together as a three.
Exactly, yeah.
By this point, you were living more outside of the country.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But so each time I would go, and in a way, inside myself, we were still a group. Every time I would go to Brazil, we would meet and talk, and we always spoke about documenting everything, and we wanted to do something with the material we had. And Genilson in São Paulo, he went around and spoke to people, since a lot of artists, every artist in the 80s had their books already, why not our group work? And that's how the interest started again to his work in the beginning, and with this fair, and with this, the Pontas de Vista, also the gallery noticed my art.
I think it would be interesting maybe to talk, if Genilson, we haven't got too much time left, but to talk about some of the projects that you did together with Francisco and Iñarra, which have, as a group, that had a different title. And maybe you could talk about the projects that you did later on in the biennial, but also in the sort of illicit projects you did with the Museum of Contemporary Art.
As pedras. Do Arte Ação.
Do Arte Ação. Do Arte Ação, o grupo, quando a Lydia foi para Nova York, nós continuamos conversando, Francisco, e resolvemos continuar com o trabalho de grupo. Estávamos quase que começando naquela época mesmo. E o primeiro projeto que nós apresentamos foi em 74, era um trabalho que foi uma Bienal Nacional, e nós pedimos um espaço aberto, e quando chegamos na hora da montagem havia um corredor estreito e baixo e escuro. Então não tinha condição de montar o trabalho que nós pretendíamos. Esse foi o primeiro trabalho crítico que nós fizemos, porque resolvemos questionar essa posição da Bienal.
Talking about other projects after 1973 and Genilson's work with Francisco, with Arte, Ação. At this stage, Genilson and Francisco were in Brazil. Lydia had already gone to New York. In 1974, there was a national Brazilian Biennale. It was in an open space in São Paulo, but the space with which they were presented to exhibit was a low, dark corridor, unsuitable for their own creative expression. And what they ended up presenting was pretty much a criticism of the context with which they were presented.
A crítica era mais o contexto de organização da Bienal.
The work they presented was itself a criticism of the way in which the exhibition had been organized.
De uma forma geral, né? O contexto geral, mas no Brasil também, não só a Bienal, mas uma coisa mais geral. A gente sabia que aquilo estava acontecendo por causa de um contexto geral.
But also, the criticism also took in the wider political and social context, because the way in which the exhibition was organized itself reflected the wider political and social conditions created by the dictatorship.
Nós chamamos esse trabalho de num espaço apertado.
And they called the work num espaço apertado, in a tight space, which obviously has a figurative meaning in the context.
Bom, a partir de então, nós percebemos que, trabalhando junto com o Francisco, a proposta do grupo tinha mudado um pouco, mas num sentido quase que político mesmo. Fizemos uma série de trabalhos a partir de então, depois dessa Bienal Nacional de 74, fizemos em 75 uma série de trabalhos com apropriação de obras do acervo do Museu de Arte Contemporânea de outros artistas, né? Utilizando peças de cada instalação, de cada trabalho.
From 74 onwards, the work that Genilson and Francisco were doing together was taking on more of a political flavour. In 1975, they did an exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in which they used physical elements from the exhibitions that other artists had put on.
O primeiro trabalho que nós fizemos chamava Evento com a Pedra Event. Evento com a Pedra Event.
The first exhibition that he did was using a stone on which they did a silk screen with which they put the word event.
And this was this was the work of another artist.
They'd taken the stone from the work of another artist, and on this stone they put the word event.
Deixa eu explicar. Era uma instalação de um artista japonês chamado Shihiro Shimotani, que consistia numa série de pedras com palavras aleatórias escritas sobre as pedras. Então, a pedra que nós escolhemos tinha a palavra event.
It was a Japanese artist whose name was?
Shimotani.
And this piece of work, this installation consisted of stones on which various words were written. They chose a stone which had the word event on it, and they took this stone and put it in various places.
Nós pegamos essa pedra, tiramos sem o conhecimento da diretoria do museu, e levamos ela para passear pelo parque e fotografar em situações normais, de uma pedra normal no meio do parque, junto com outras pedras, com lixo, com a lama e coisas assim.
They shocked the exhibition organisers by taking the stone, and they took it outside the exhibition space and made photographs of putting the stone in various odd contexts in amongst litter, in the middle of the park, in other places, moving this element of the exhibition into completely different contexts.
Como se fosse uma pedra comum, não uma obra de arte.
As if it were a completely normal stone, not part of an artistic exhibition.
And it was also importantly part of the collection of the museum, so it's equivalent to maybe going to one of the museums here, taking a work out and putting it in the middle of Trafalgar Square and taking photographs of it and putting it back. So it was this kind of, the fact that you were able to steal it was...
O trabalho foi montado numa sequência em que tem essa documentação do parque e até o retorno ao local da instalação do museu.
They photographed the stone in such a way that it was a sequence of photographs with the stone in different places, telling the story of the movement of the stone until... And at the end, they put the stone back in its original position in the exhibition.
Então nós mostramos essa documentação para o diretor do museu e ele teve uma grande surpresa quando viu o trabalho, tomou um susto muito grande, mas logo se refez e percebeu a ideia do
An
trabalho.
interesting story of showing the director of the museum what they'd done. His initial reaction was one of great shock, but then he quickly became aware of the artistic validity of what they'd done with the stone.
And similarly, the project that you and Francisco did together for the next biennial, when you were entered into the biennial space, were you given permission to do that, or you were just able to access the building?
Without permission.
You went to
Bom, esse trabalho da pedra ele teve um complemento, porque surgiu uma discussão com o diretor do museu, né? Ele questionava, é uma questão de os valores, né? Ele comparava, por exemplo, a gente não dá muita importância porque é uma pedra. Imagina se fosse com um dequílico, por exemplo, né? Um trabalho de dequílico fora do museu. Então nós resolvemos juntar a pedra com o dequílico fora do museu. Então finalizamos esse trabalho com o encontro da pedra e vende com uma pintura que chamava Cavalos da Beira-Mar, do lado da escola do museu, fotografamos, devolvemos as duas coisas.
The reaction of the exhibition director, one of great shock, but they ended up having conversations about what they'd done by removing this stone, and they said, well, it's only a stone, but what if it had been an actual important painting from the exhibition, the other artists exhibiting their work in the exhibition.
Such as the Kiriko. The Kiriko is the artist, very famous, so that's why it's shocking. The museum was shocked.
See. And how, do you think there's a relationship between that project you did as part of Ação, Art Action, and others you did together with Francisco? Was there a way in which that group had a specific...
O título Arte e Ação veio porque a gente achava que era quase como era como se fosse estávamos em plena ditadura e havia vários grupos guerrilheiros, então era um nome muito próximo de um grupo guerrilheiro. A gente considerava o trabalho como uma ação guerrilheira. A gente chegava, fazia e depois mostrava, né, o resultado.
Genilson's saying that Arte e Ação, the name of the group, it came from a political context in which there were urban guerrilla groups. Art, Action, the name itself was somewhat reminiscent of names of clandestine political groups, and there was a political element in what they were doing, and also almost a parallel between their artistic modus operandi and the way that guerrillas would behave. They'd go, they'd do their operation, and then present it.
And was that the same kind of process with this project, which was for the...
This
essas fotos. Was it the same kind of process?
Não. Em 77 nós ficamos 3 meses trabalhando no interior do prédio da Bienal, porque nesse momento era possível se fazer isso, hoje em dia não é mais possível.
The pictures you can see is from the Biennale of 77, and the circumstances there were somewhat different from this, what we might call the guerrilla art. in 1977, they actually, by this time, they had a space within the exhibition and they were able to work there for 3 months.
But this was before the biennial opened?
Before the biennial.
With permission to use the building freely?
Não, porque o prédio vivia vazio, não acontecia nada entre um evento e outro. Agora não, porque são vários eventos.
So the 3 months in which they prepared the exhibition, actually the museum was empty. They made use of a space that wasn't being used.
Então, para esse trabalho, nós utilizamos o que encontramos dentro do prédio da Bienal, material de depósito e sobra de outras exposições.
So what they were using was just what they literally just found there waiting for them within the building. Objects that were lying there.
Nós trabalhamos com essas peças tratando de formas escultóricas, né? Tratando cada peça de uma maneira escultórica, quase como uma instalação. Né?
So they were sculpting the materials in an improvised way, as if it were an installation.
E ficamos trabalhando durante esses 3 meses até que chegou o momento de começar a Bienal e nós apresentamos toda essa sequência, essa documentação em grande quadro dentro da nossa instalação.
They worked with these materials for 3 months until the actual opening of the biennial.
That showed the photographs.
And
then showed the photographs of the preparatory process.
I think that we probably need to start wrapping up, or at least offering opportunity for questions. So I wanted to ask one final question before we do that, maybe to both of you. It's a question just to both of you, but how is it now, you're both still here, artists who are working, how is this process of the kind of rediscovery of your work affecting you, and how do you feel, you look at this period and that it still influences or informs how you work now? Did you?
Eu acho que tem grande revival dos anos 70 atualmente. E estão se redescobrindo os artistas daquela época. Os trabalhos que sumiram, né, desapareceram, foram feitos, são trabalhos efêmeros que fica a documentação. Então, não é fácil de achar, né, porque a maioria desses arquivos estavam comigo.
The way that Genilson's work is being looked at now, it does constitute something of a revival of that 70s work. It was work which didn't have a high profile in the intervening years.
Estavam comigo,
the photographic images were Genilson who actually had them, so they weren't a high profile in those years, and now, yes, it does constitute something of a rediscovery.
And how does it relate to, you continue to produce work, to produce new work, and is there a relationship between this past and how you work now?
Às vezes eu costumo dizer que eu penso como o meu iPod, porque eu deixo o meu iPod na sequência aleatória e muitas vezes eu estou ouvindo música dos anos 30 e de repente vem o Radiohead em seguida. Eu acho que é tudo relativo, está tudo muito próximo. Eu não vejo conflito. Né?
As to the idea of whether what Genilson is producing now is a recall of what he was doing in the 70s, well, there's a random element. It's a bit like the artistic equivalent of having the iPod on shuffle, that these works from the past can reappear at times.
In my case, this was 40 years ago, and the way it's being shown again, I just feel I'm so glad, because I was not expecting much, but we were really doing these very freely. There was no model. Nobody had done these things at that time. And there was the excitement of doing something we wanted to do. So it's like iPod, we pod. We did it, you know, we were doing it. So I'm very glad, and now it's impossible to get in an institution and do whatever we want. It's so controlled, and it's not what we want. But I am glad that people recognize the value, the beauty of the action and or the freedom of the youth that we had. And it was just the process of change of the whole world we live in, actually, all these years. And it's very important to think about it and what has changed in what way, and what we have to keep, or what we learned, or I think everything is so meaningful to us.
Queria acrescentar que eu sinto, é um momento muito feliz para mim, porque é como se fosse um sonho de 40 anos atrás. Há 40 anos atrás, quando fizemos esse trabalho, foi um período em que a gente vivia em plena ditadura. O Gilberto Gil e o Caetano Veloso foram exilados vieram para aqui, para Londres, e eu morria de inveja dessa possibilidade deles estarem aqui nessa época, dessa Londres, desse período, né? Eu sonhava com aquilo. Eu disse, puxa, pensava até em fazer alguma ação guerrilheira para ver se ela mandasse também para lá, né, para cá. Eu acho tudo relativo, né? Eu estou tão feliz quanto antes. Eu estaria antes, se eu tivesse vindo antes para cá. Estou muito feliz de estar aqui, estou muito feliz de estar participando da Frieze com esse trabalho, inclusive com esse trabalho, né? Junta outra vez essa coisa da relatividade do tempo. Né? É bom estar mostrando uma coisa de 40 anos atrás agora. Né?
Genilson said he's delighted to be here showing the work at Frieze. It's as if it was a dream from 40 years ago. 40 years ago, 1973, it's the height of the Brazilian dictatorship. At that time he saw Gilberto Gil, Caetano Veloso actually being exiled to London. They were exiled, but actually Genilson's reaction was one of being green with envy that these guys were being exiled to London. And he thought, gosh, you know, maybe I need to get into an urban guerrilla, and maybe they'll exile me and send me to London. But he's delighted to be here and see the connection between the work of 40 years ago and now connected with Frieze in 2013.
I think it might be time to take questions. Actually, if anyone wants to ask a question or perhaps refer back to some of the works that we didn't discuss in too much detail.
Any questions?
Brazil is, when foreigners come to Brazil these days, they're very impressed on the amount of collectives that exist at the moment. Quer que eu fale português primeiro?
Se pudesse, seria melhor.
Okay, so I'm going to say in Portuguese and then in English.
Você pode falar em inglês, depois me faz a pergunta em português.
Bom, falar em português primeiro. Quando os estrangeiros vão para o Brasil, principalmente pesquisar arte, eles ficam muito impressionados com o número de trabalhos em coletivos que estão acontecendo no Brasil no momento. Existe um mapeamento que chama de Interações, uma plataforma, um festival de coletivos no Brasil. Como que se vocês conhecem o trabalho desses coletivos novos no Brasil, e como que vocês comparam um trabalho que surgiu na ditadura de coletivo para um trabalho de coletivo que está sendo realizado hoje? Vou só falar em inglês porque você poderia entender, tá bom? So my question is about the work of new collectives in Brazil. It's very known to have a large number of collectives working at the moment, and I would like to know the difference or issues of the dictatorial period and the collectives there are today in work.
Bom, em 1980 surgiu esse movimento transvanguarda em São Paulo, não, no Brasil. Foi feita uma exposição chamada Geração 80, E eu conversei muito com o Francisco sobre isso. Eu disse, olha, Francisco, eu acho que a gente vai ter que dar um tempo muito longo, porque está começando um novo movimento e não vai haver mais espaço para o nosso tipo de trabalho. Ficamos um longo período, quase 30 anos, fazendo coisas eventuais, trabalhando, continuando trabalhando, mas eu fazia freelancer, coisas assim. E depois desse período, já nos anos, quase dos anos 2000, né, mais ou menos, eu trabalhava numa firma, fazia projetos de stands, né, Quem vai dizer isso?
He was working for a company who mounted those exhibition booths for fairs, commercial fairs, for corporations.
Eu trabalhei durante um tempo com isso aí e depois eu saí dessa firma e fui passar pelos museus outra vez com um portfólio remontado para dizer, olha, eu sou Genilson, fazia esse trabalho e conhecer as pessoas novas, porque muita gente tinha mudado dos museus, ninguém me conhecia mais.
Through the 80s, Genilson had to look for a job, and also because he was away from the type of the change of institutional environment, it was hard for him to reintroduce himself to those to the artistic environment again.
Eu rodei pelos museus e instituições até que cheguei no Centro Cultural Maria Antônia, em que tinha um diretor chamado Lorenzo Mami, e ele ficou fascinado quando viu o trabalho e imediatamente nos convidou para fazer uma exposição na instituição.
So I ended up looking for an institution, and finally I went to this space whose director was Lorenzo Mami, and he immediately liked the kind of things I was showing, we were showing.
O que ele destacava mais era essa questão do coletivo, porque estavam surgindo os grupos coletivos no Brasil inteiro, e ele achava que o nosso trabalho como um grupo de coletivos seria um trabalho bem pioneiro. Ele queria mostrar que já existia esse tipo de coisa, de atitude, né, em relação à arte.
So he was very interested to see our work because he was working with the collective type of idea, and he wanted to show our work in order to show that these type of tendency existed before.
He recognized that it was something people were interested
Some of
in now.
pioneer work as a collective.
Fizemos uma exposição que era uma espécie de retrospectiva, uma mini retrospectiva do grupo, né, das atividades do grupo, mas tínhamos também trabalhos atuais, né, mostramos trabalhos atuais.
So that space was called Space of Maria Antonia, the name of the street that gave the name to the space. And we then presented some kind of a mini retrospective. At the same time, we did our contemporary, on the spot, new work as well in the space, installations.
Any other questions?
Quando a gente pensa nesses grupos brasileiros dos anos 70, Viaja Sem Passaporte, Manga Rosa, 3x3, o trabalho de vocês, uma das questões que vocês chegaram a mencionar é essa vontade de sair às ruas, de retomar as ruas, que está ligado a esse momento de um certo abrandamento da ditadura e já a retomada real das ruas no início dos anos 80 e mais tarde o movimento das diretas já, enfim. E existe nisso, claro, não só essa vontade de retomar o espaço público, o espaço urbano, mas uma crítica, enfim, como vocês também mencionaram, a certas instituições, a uma instituição maior que representaria, enfim, a ditadura no país nesse momento, mas a instituições artísticas, como vocês mencionaram. Eu queria saber de que modo vocês, nesse momento, também estavam informados ou não sobre outros movimentos relacionados à chamada crítica institucional em outros contextos. Se isso era uma referência ou se isso partia, como parece partir, de outras, de questões, enfim, genuinamente brasileiras, digamos assim.
Não sei se é muito fácil entender.
Should I translate that? I will try to, I'm sorry about that. Anyway, I will try.
Maybe translation
Like
summary.
Yeah, summary. You want to translate
No,
that?
no.
Okay. So, well, as you mentioned, thinking about those groups in Brazil in the 1970s, such as Viajou Sem Passaporte, Manga Rosa, and so on, it is very clear this movement of reoccupying the streets and related to this very moment of the dictatorship, which was, I don't know how to say that, sendo abrandada, well, in a way, slowing down, in a way. And it is very clear that institution was a question in this way, the major institution of the Brazilian government, as well as the art institution, as an institution, and artistic institutions as well. So I wonder how and in which way at this moment you were informed or not by what we call the institutional critique in other contexts, artistic contexts.
Bom, uma boa parte desses grupos que você citou, eu tive bastante contato com eles, trabalhei junto, inclusive, não juntos, como grupos, participando juntos em exposições coletivas. Né? Eu acho normal, né? Acho normal que aconteça coisas como essa. Né? Não sei se você teria uma outra opinião sobre isso, mas acho normal esse tipo de o que aconteceu, né? O surgimento desses grupos, a atuação deles, a forma semelhante, mesmo agora, recentemente, tivemos uma exposição junto com o Grupo Três, em que eu fiz um recorte da nossa produção para mostrar um trabalho mais próximo dos trabalhos deles.
E sobre se vocês tinham algum tipo de informação, por exemplo, sobre o que fazia o Fred Wilson, o Hans Hack, ou o próprio Daniel Villen, em alguns contextos específicos.
Muito de leve.
Isso não era algo que informava vocês?
Não.
Em 1970,
In English.
Yeah. In 1970, when we were starting the Lanchon Arte, Restaur Arte, and all that, I had started my college, and at the same time, in Brazil, we didn't have much information. We had to read in Spanish or French or English, and I was reading in Japanese as well because I could find very dense articles about art, Western art. And I was very impressed when I read about 1970s Tokyo Biennial. And that was unique because it never happened again, but they invited 40 Western artists, conceptual nature. And I learned about Soloway and Klaus Rinke, Hans Hack. I'm not sure of Hake, but I think Yanis Cornelis, it was, anyways, 40 people.
One of the projects that you interpreted for to include the excluded was Daniel Buren, no?
Daniel Buren also was Cornelis. I learned about
maybe not direct, like
Art Povera and all that. I got so excited. I brought the magazine to the class, and our teacher also got very enthusiastic, and the classmates also. He suggested, why don't you guys have a show, an exhibition of your conceptual work? Because I was also doing my project. I'm not going to refer to that, it's kind of long, but it was one of the requirement of the curriculum to do an internship in an ad agency. I went to the most important, biggest art agency, and it was like 3 months of doing layouts for ads, like ice cream, outdoors. At that time, big outdoors were shown. And I would see my sketch become an outdoor, but that was like another type of art. Anyways, I took I had my picture taken of time cards. So I somehow managed to get photographs of those time cards, because I couldn't take it myself.
The things you would use to
record the time in, time out.
When you go to work.
Yeah, so I wanted to have the cards, and it was a big thing, but I managed to have them take the pictures and give me a copy. So on the days that I was not doing the agency work, I was doing some kind of my art activity in the art competition. So I also showed that work. And the teacher said, oh, it's very good work, because right now we're having a student movement in Europe and all these manifestations in '68 and all that. And this is very important because you're talking about workers, labor and all that. So that was one of my work, and I presented other things, but I invited him and Iñarra. We had, I think, 8 people show. Mario Schemberg came to this exhibition, and he said, this is the first conceptual art exhibition in Brazil. And I was like, wow.
And where was it?
In 1971.
In which?
Sesc. It was like a cultural center. Yeah. And we got some, we had to go to newspaper to explain what we were doing, and the reporter came to the opening, and he saw one criticism. We did that work on the same day. We got the newspaper article that had come out that day. But somehow what we had explained to him came out differently in the article, so we fixed it. Our opinion was like this on the newspaper, and we pasted it, and the reporter got so upset, he got so angry, he ran to the art critic, and Professor Schemberg said, well, artists can do that. And he just went, he left. And for many years he was really upset with us. But finally we made peace. But anyways, that was the context. In 1973, since you mentioned some artists traveled without passport, when I decided to come to New York, because I met Klaus Rinke here, and he said, every artist would rather spend 3 months at least living in New York. I said, I'm going to go there. So he said, let's go to the office. I'm going to send a letter to a friend, you could stay there. If you want to, you could babysit her baby. And so we decided that day, and I went to the travel agency, and they said, oh, you're single, you're a woman? No way. We are in the dictatorship time. Even if your parents are accompanying you, they're not going to let you go. You're not going to find a visa, tourist visa. No way. So no. So I had to look for a student visa. Luckily, the faculty's, director of the faculty's wife had been at Pratt Graphic Center in New York, and she said, you just send your slides, and I sent them, and they accepted me, so it was great.
Thank you. I think it's time for us to close now, but I'm sure if anyone wants to ask a question.
If someone wants to ask a question more informally, then you won't mind if someone approaches you as we start to break up now. But I think it's 8 o'clock, so we need to close.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thank you guys.